They had tremendous charisma. I knew that alone would sell them.
The Beatles would never have been the same without George Martin, a crucial piece that defined the band's sound. From backwards guitar solos to string quartets, as well as his enormous ability to materialize all the ideas that John, Paul, George, and Ringo had for their songs. But although he was always very pleased with his work, there were some exceptions. And in today's video, we'll review some Beatles songs that George Martin didn't like very much. This song by George Harrison was a mockery of the record business, a classic double pun of George's characteristic cynicism, where in his lyrics he also touched on the issue of the royalty distribution for Beatles songs, where he and Ringo were the most harmed. The song began to be recorded in February 1967 as the song Harrison would contribute to the Sgt. Pepper's album, but no one was very interested in it, not even Harrison at all. Contrasting it with the tunes that would make the track list, George Martin said of the song, "I'm disappointed that George didn't bring something better." Faced with everyone's disinterest in continuing to work on it, Harrison put it aside for a while, and it was officially released until January 1969, when it found its way on the soundtrack of Yellow Submarine. Sometime later, George Martin said that it was the track he hated most from Harrison.
Number 9.
Revolution 9 is the penultimate track on the Beatles, which is commonly known as the White Album. Entirely composed of random voices, songs, and snippets of noise, it was a creation made solely by John Lennon and Yoko Ono, with George Harrison assisting at times. But the other band members and George Martin hated it. It was a controversial cut, a song, music, an experiment. The assembly of these sounds was the cause of disputes between Lennon and George Martin and Paul McCartney, who did not want it to be released under the Beatles' name. And although there were some vocal snippets of George Martin's voice, he was reluctant to release it as the band's work. But over time, he changed his mind about this Lennon song. I went to India in September 1966. It was becoming difficult for me because I wasn't really that into it. I just got back from India, and my heart was still out there. After what had happened in 1966, everything else seemed like hard work. It was a job, like doing something I didn't really want to do, and I was losing interest in being fab at that point, related George Harrison. After one of his songs was rejected for Sgt. Pepper's, and with the intention of not being left out, to everyone's relief, George popped into the sessions with another composition that fit in perfectly with where his enthusiasm was right then. And it fit in perfectly with the kaleidoscope of musical genres on display on the album. The song was Within You Without You. However, Harrison's work did not please George Martin. In the book The Beatles, paperback writer includes an interview with Martin from 1979. In it, he discussed the songs from Sgt. Pepper's. George's contribution was, with all deference to George, a rather dreary song, heavily influenced by his obsession with Indian music at that time, he said. I worked very closely with him on the scoring of it, using a string orchestra, and he brought in some friends from the Indian Music Association to play special instruments. But over the years, Martin described this song as his least favorite from that project. George Martin hated One After 909, a John Lennon and Paul McCartney song that they began writing even before Love Me Do. The song dates from 1957 and was one of Lennon and McCartney's earliest compositions. And although they returned to the song in the 1969 Get Back sessions and it would end up being part of the Let It Be album, a recording made in March 1963 was not to Martin's total liking. During an interview in 2004, Martin spoke about his meeting with the Beatles. When I first met them in 1962, their material was terrible, he said. Their songs were, One After 909? What the hell was that? It was silly stuff. Not very good, really. But they had this charisma and they had this potential. The Beatles rarely sang in another language, but this was an exception. This single, released in February 1964 in West Germany, included the German versions of I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. The German branch of EMI insisted to Brian Epstein and George Martin that the Beatles should record their most successful songs in German so that they could sell more records in the country. They laughed and said, "That's absolute rubbish." So I said, "Well, if we want to sell records in Germany, that's what we've got to do." So they agreed to record in German. I mean, really, it was rubbish. But the company sent over one Otto Demlar to help coach them in German, said George Martin. When it was announced that the surviving Beatles, Paul, George, and Ringo would be working on some John Lennon demos for his Anthology project, it was said that George Martin would not be able to participate as producer due to his hearing problems. And with this, Jeff Lynne was chosen as producer of the sessions. But that's not what he told Rockseller magazine in a 2013 interview. "I kinda told them I wasn't too happy with putting them together with the dead John," he said. "I've got nothing wrong with Dead John, but the idea of having Dead John with live Paul and Ringo and George to form a group, it didn't appeal to me too much. In the same way that I think it's okay to find an old record of Nat King Cole's and bring it back to life and issue it. But to have him singing with his daughter is another thing. So I don't know. I'm not fussy about it, but it didn't appeal to me very much. I think I might have done it if they asked me, but they didn't." He added, though, that he would have taken a different approach. Instead of breaking down Lennon's demo and trying to dub over it, he would have had George, Paul, and Ringo use the demo as only that, a roadmap to create a new song. John's voice could be dropped in, but it wouldn't be as central to the recording. The recordings that the Beatles left during the Get Back sessions were more or less a disaster. Although George Martin served as executive producer of the sessions, it was Glyn Johns who was really in charge of the project. It was he who initially presented the first version of the album to the Beatles, but unfortunately it was rejected. He then made a second cut, which was also rejected, and after analyzing the problems of the recordings, the Beatles put the project aside while the film was being edited. George Martin didn't want to get into trouble, and didn't want to finish producing the record that would later become Let It Be. Although he helped with the singles of the time, the record had no direction until Phil Spector came to the rescue. The final work we all know was to the liking of John, Ringo, and George, but not of Martin and McCartney. They criticized the album and Spector's wall of sound for decades, and when the new millennium and new formats arrived, talking about re-releases of the Let It Be movie, Paul and George Martin released Let It Be Naked, a version much closer to the original project of the Get Back sessions. Well, that's all for now. George Martin left an amazing legacy that to this day we continue to talk about. Comment below what you think of his comments, and we will also be reading what else you would like to see on the channel. We invite you to subscribe if you don't already, and please like the video. This is Music Box.